America is enormous. It's a really big country. And unlike some other countries who might be the same size or bigger, America is a little bit different because we actually have people in almost all of the country. Think about Canada and Russia. There's huge parts of the country where nobody lives. And because we're so big and spread out, transportation is extremely important. We're making and growing stuff all over the country, but how do we get it to market? Well, the 1790s to the 1820s had been the turnpike era. Remember, these are toll roads, right? But they were inadequate. Rivers were way better because weight didn't matter. Once you put something on a boat, it didn't matter that much how heavy it was. But the problem with rivers, of course, is they don't go everywhere. So the solution is to dig canals. These tend to be financed by state governments, and they massively improve our transportation infrastructure. The greatest canal in American history is the Erie Canal. This is a 350-mile canal. You see it here on the map, connecting the Great Lakes to the Hudson River, which means that you could get on a boat and go from the Great Lakes, or you could go from, say, Chicago, Illinois, across the Great Lakes, across the canal, and all the way to New York City, and then into the Atlantic Ocean, of course. This was begun in 1817, and it was the greatest construction project attempted by Americans up to that point. Canals are wide. The Erie Canal is 40 feet wide. It had two-way traffic. But it was only 4 feet deep because they put them on these flat boats that really have no bottom, that don't draw any water. And then the boats are actually pulled by horses that walk along these tow paths along the side. You can see it in the bottom two pictures. And so the ships are actually pulled by horses. Now the problem is the land isn't flat. So you have to build locks. And locks are these series of gates. This is an Erie Canal lock, where they drop one of the gates, you enter into it, then they raise the other gate if you want to raise the level of the water, or they do that in reverse if you want to lower the level of the water. So this is pretty cool technology here on how you change elevation in a canal. The Erie Canal has 88 locks, and it opens in 1825. It was so crowded, it was so widely used, it paid for itself in 7 years. And it's also going to change the politics of America. It is going to connect the Midwest, Chicago, or I should say Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, Minnesota, that part of the country, to the Northeast, to Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts, economically. In fact, the economic connection of the Midwest and the Northeast is so powerful that the Erie Canal guarantees that New York will be the primary city, the largest and most important economic city in America, all by itself. Ironically, the canal's heyday is important but very, very short, as railroads begin to threaten the canals almost as soon as they're completed in most cases. So let's look at early railroads. In the 1820s and 1830s, railroads existed, but they were not a major form of transportation. The first lines were established, the technology was improved, and corporations to run the railroad companies began to be established, but they weren't widely used. As you can see, the railroad map on the top there with the little blue lines, those were all the railroads in 1835. That's not a very effective or comprehensive railroad system. The first railroad in America was built in 1820 at a private house, or I should say estate, of a man named John Stevens in New Jersey. The first commercial railroad was the B&O. It ran 13 miles out of Baltimore. In 1831, Albany, New York got a 13-mile track as well. By 1836, there's only 1,000 miles of track in 11 states. By 1840, that number is almost to 3,000. By 1860, it'll be 27,000 miles of railroad. And you see the map there in 1870. So railroad is something that's going to start little, but become extremely big. Most of it is in the north. The south has far fewer railroads than the north. It leads to some fantastic engineering projects. The Great Iron Bridge across the Mississippi, for example. It turned Chicago into one of the most, probably the second most important city in America, eventually, as Chicago is the railroad hub of the Midwest. The Mississippi River and the Erie Canal become far less important because it is cheaper and easier to send things on train. And it further weakens the connection between the North and the South. As railroads tend to not run north and south, the economic connection just isn't there. While as you can just look at the map there, the Midwest and the Northeast are becoming knit together ever closer. The railroads are built largely through the help of the federal government. Congress will give over 30 million acres to railroad corporations for free by 1860. State and local governments help finance the construction, and towns had to give the railroad companies lots of money because wherever the railroad went, that's where there was going to be growth. If the railroad skipped you and went to another town, your town was going to get big and the other town was going to shrink. Or the other way around. Wherever the railroad goes, there's growth. Areas that had been cut off during the winter now had year-round supplies. There were parts of the country that when it snowed, nobody could get to them. But of course, the railroads, winter doesn't really bother the railroads. And so it's going to begin to really change how people's lives work. Shipping gets a lot faster. The Erie Canal, it took 3 weeks for something to get from New York to Chicago. On a train, it took 2 days. But probably the most important impact of railroads is the birth of the American corporation. The corporation, which is a lot of people investing into a company in joint ownership, the American corporation anyway, will largely be born to own and operate the railroad companies. And these corporations, of course, through today, are a major force in both economic and political terms in American history. The railroad itself became a symbol of American progress and prosperity. For many people who lived at the time, there was a certain romanticism and a fascination with the railroad, and it was certainly encapsulated this idea that America was big and powerful and important. Let's talk about communication. Mail was slow, and think about this. Up until this point, if you wanted to transmit information or a piece of paper, something like that, somebody had to physically do that. Somebody had to travel from one place to another. Our lives don't work like that today. Well, that begins when Samuel F.B. Morse invents the telegraph and Morse code to transmit things over the telegraph. This is basically an electric wire strung between two places, and by opening and closing the electric circuit, you send messages. In 1843, Congress paid $30,000 to build an experimental telegraph connecting Baltimore and Washington, D.C. The first message transmitted was that James K. Polk had been nominated by the Democrats for the presidency. By 1860, there's more than 50,000 miles of wire running across the United States. In 1861, a 3,595-mile wire connects New York and San Francisco. By 1866, there's a transatlantic wire, so we can send messages back and forth to Europe. The telegraph came with the railroad track. The easiest thing to do if you wanted to lay telegraph wire is to go where the railroad tracks was, right? You put all your telegraph poles and your wire on the train, and then you just roll down the track, pull them off, and set it up as you go. So usually when you saw a train track, you would see telegraph lines going next to it. And the trains loved this because if the trains broke down or had any problems, they could tap straight into the telegraph line and send messages to the stations. So the telegraph lines and the train tracks were intimately connected and shared a symbiotic relationship, both benefiting from the presence of the other. Consequently, the telegraph station where you went to get your messages, your telegrams, were in the train stations because that's where the lines went. And the two industries combined to become absolutely dominant in transportation and communication. The telegraph also leads to the birth of modern news. In 1846, the Associated Press is formed. Now, back in the day, your newspaper would carry local news, but any news from anywhere that wasn't immediately in the area had to come by word of mouth or by letter. So that news would be old. And so your newspaper might report on what happened in New York City 2 months ago. But with the telegraph, we can now send that stuff down the line. And so what happened is newspaper offices all over the country entered into this alliance, the Associated Press, and they would send each other their stories. So that meant that if you went down and picked up the San Francisco or the Chicago or the New York paper, you would have the news not just from your city, but from all over the country thanks to the telegraph wire. That's the Associated Press. Really important. And of course today we expect to walk around with our smartphones and get the news wherever we are all over the world. And this is the beginning of that. In 1846, a man named Hoe invents the steam cylinder press, which is this device here, which makes it very, very easy and cheap to print newspapers. And this is going to dramatically increase the availability of news. Before, newspapers had been kind of expensive and really only elites had read them. By the 1840s, we begin to see the penny press. These are newspapers that you can buy for a penny. And a literate population, thanks to an increase in public schooling, will read newspapers all the time. Most Americans will pick up and read a daily newspaper by this period. So we have a much more, well, kind of informed. The newspapers weren't terribly journalistic, but better, more informed than we have been before. In 1840, for example, the number one newspaper in New York had a circulation of 8,000. By 1860, the number one newspaper in New York, the New York Herald, had a circulation of 77,000. And so you can see this massive increase in people reading the news.